Hi, everybody. Joseph Lear here with Slow Burn Christianity and Pastoral Theology on Substack. Last week in Iowa City, where I live, an undocumented immigrant was tackled by ICE agents in a local coffee shop and lunch hotspot in downtown Iowa City. They were in plain clothes, and they did this at the height of the lunch hour. Why they arrested him in public at that particular location is something that I don't have answers to, but I find somewhat troubling. We know from news reports that he had an ankle monitor on, and he had just been in Chicago for an immigration appointment. They did not arrest him at the immigration appointment, though clearly they had opportunity to do so. They also didn't just go knock on the door of his home address where they knew he would be, not only because he had provided a home address to them, but also because he had an ankle monitor on, so they would know if he was home. They didn't do either of those things. Instead, they waited until a very busy lunch hour in plain clothes to tackle him. I say all this because it strikes me that there's at least some aspect of political theater here, that ICE, these ICE agents, maybe ICE in general, wanted to make a scene. They wanted an audience when this all could have been done quietly. This week, Pope Leo has made some comments about how being pro-life is, by necessity, to also acknowledge and practice the dignity of all peoples, especially immigrants, in the context of the United States. And of course, the political backlash, if you want to call it that, has already begun with a number of news commentators once again pandering in sort of this political theater by either being truly or pretending to be outraged by what seems to me to be a pretty typical comment from the Vatican about human dignity. I say all of this because it's so important for us as Christians to think Christianly about all things, but in particular to try to think Christianly about these very public issues, especially ones that have to do with human dignity, because human dignity is grounded in the idea, the fact, the belief that we have as Christians that all people are made in the image of God, and that if we are going to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, as Jesus said, we have to love our neighbor as ourselves. And our neighbor is not it happens to be the people that just are in our vicinity. This book just recently came out. It's called I Was a Stranger and You Took Me In, Pentecostal Responses to the Refugee Crisis. It's been put out by Pickwick out of Wittgenstock in Oregon. It's edited by my colleague and friend Lois Olina. And I have a chapter in the book in which I talk about the story of Ruth and how the story of Ruth can teach the church certain communal virtues that we can practice ahead of time, perhaps for years, as a matter of routine, before anybody in need, especially the immigrant, happens to show up on our doorstep. This book, along with all sorts of other tremendous Christian resources that are actually increasingly easy to find on the internet, both books, podcasts, short and long form journalism, and so on, is an incredible resource because, as the summary on the back of the book says, Pentecostals are uniquely positioned to address with compassion and Christ-like love this global crisis, the global migrant crisis that we are in fact facing. And the reason that we are uniquely positioned is twofold. First of all, Pentecostalism has always been first and foremost a missionary movement within the Church Catholic. The Azusa Street Revival, they didn't build a church on Azusa Street. In fact, the barn where they were meeting no longer exists. What they did instead was they sent missionaries all over the place, first to the East Coast, then to Europe, and then places like Africa. Where I grew up in Burkina Faso, there were Assemblies of God missionaries there as early as, I believe it was 1923, which is not even 20 years after the Azusa Street Revival, which is pretty astounding. Missionaries are all immigrants because we're going places where we don't belong to proclaim the gospel. And that brings me to the second reason why I think Pentecostals are uniquely positioned, and that is that Pentecostalism is a uniquely global movement that has no boundaries. It has no borders. Pentecostals are from every tribe, every language, every tongue, under the sun. And in this book, we don't just have people from all sorts of disciplines talking about immigration from a sort of Western perspective, but we have Pentecostals who themselves are not Westerners talking about this tremendously important global phenomenon. So again, I encourage us all to think Christianly, to try to step outside of all of the toxic political rhetoric and think, what am I called to do as a Christian when it comes to strangers knocking on my door? And what are we called to do as a church when strangers come knocking on our collective door, whether that's the door of the church or the door of the country that we happen to all live in? We're citizens of the kingdom. We are empowered by the Spirit, which means we are able to think outside of the box, outside the political box that all the news agencies and our politicians and our social commentators and social media algorithms want to insist on putting us in.